If you were a kid who liked trains in the UK during the 2000s, you may have come across these things. These were a set of handmade figures by a company called Elgate, or Elgate maybe, who specialise in giftware and souvenirs. I had these figurines as a kid and thought they were pretty cool, though they definitely give off "we have Thomas and friends at home" energy. So why don't we go one step further and redesign them to look like Sodor engines? Let's give it a go. I was pretty confident what I wanted Rocket to be. They're a red 064 tank engine with large boxy tanks, so it seemed like an obvious choice to make them a Midland Railway flat iron. I've got a bit of a history with this type of engine. It was one of the first trains models I ever completed, which is nearly 15 years ago. And I also drew a picture of a flat iron for New Year's Day 2020 on Twitter with the caption, "Let's make this year a good one." So yeah, that didn't age too well. I was thinking about where to place these engines within the timeline and geography of the Railway series books, and that got me thinking of the branch lines that don't really get talked about in the stories. There's the Norrumby branch and the Kirk Ronan branch, but then I thought about the Alsborough branch line in its original form before it was reopened as the Little Western. It originally operated from 1916 to 1947 before it was unofficially closed and then reopened again in the 60s, so perhaps Rocket, Puff and Shunt operated the Alsborough branch during that early period. We know nothing about the engines that ran it, and yet they must have existed. I'm using a photo of the Cambrian Coast Railway as a reference, since that was one of the inspirations for the Alsborough branch in the books. And given the time period, I've decided to go for a style similar to C. Reginald Dalby for these illustrations. His work is kind of love it or hate it, but I really like the idyllic pastoral vibe of his illustrations, and when he gets the engine's proportions right, his stuff looks great. So the flat irons were originally built for passenger work, but had a tendency to derail at high speeds, which led them to being consigned to freight duties, and I'm thinking this could inspire Rocket's character. Maybe they're overconfident and don't pay attention to the track, they're just obsessed with going as fast as they can even if it's dangerous to do so. Maybe Rocket has a rivalry with James since they're both red, and tries to get their trains to Tidmouth before James's connecting train or something like that. You could say that my take on Rocket is a bit of a James clone, but James isn't reckless, and I like to think he has some interest in the safety and well-being of his passengers, whilst Rocket has very little. Then there could be a point in the story where Rocket has an accident, nothing too lethal, but they come off the rails, and the Fat Controller puts them on goods duties to humble them. Then afterwards, a wiser Rocket can either go back to pulling coaches, or decide that they prefer pulling trucks. So you might notice that occasionally I'll open up a layer with a Dalby illustration in there, and that's not because I'm copying directly, it's just, well, to use as reference and also for colour picking, because I think the colours are really important in the Dalby illustrations. Time to paint the coaches in that trademark orange livery that they have in the early Railway series books. Obviously I've got to give Rocket a nice plume of smoke coming out from the funnel, and not to mention Dalby's trademark motion lines. So to refresh everyone's memory, here is the original figurine, and here is my take on that same engine. The first challenge to overcome here was to find a basis. Standard gauge 460 tank engines basically don't exist in the UK, so I had to look for an engine overseas. I managed to find a suitable basis in the Cork, Bandon and South Coast Railway 460 tank, also known as the Bandon tank. The reason for their unusual wheel arrangement was because a 462 tank wouldn't be able to fit on the railway's turntables, so possibly Puff was purchased for a similar reason. Maybe Rocket was the first engine on the branch, and Puff had to be a similar size to Rocket so that the infrastructure on the line didn't have to be replaced. The Bandon tanks were mixed traffic engines, so perhaps Puff is the goods engine on the branch, but easily adapts to passenger duties after Rocket's accident. I'm thinking that Puff could work as a foil to Rocket, sensible and stern as opposed to reckless and carefree, but unlike, say, Edward, who's kind and modest, Puff is quite cocky about the fact that he's the sensible one. He and Rocket butt heads and often partake in funnel measuring contests, and Puff enjoys correcting Rocket when they make a mistake. Actually, if you'd paid attention to the track you wouldn't have come off the rails. I probably should have given him nerd glasses, but that wouldn't be accurate to the figurine. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I had these three figurines as a kid, but I don't recall the green engine being called Puff. I remember him being called something else. And whilst making this video, I actually unearthed my old Puff figurine from back in the day, and lo and behold, he wasn't called Puff, he was called Duke. There isn't a lot of documentation on these figurines, basically it's just a few photos from some eBay listings, but there doesn't seem to be any online record of the green one having a different name at one point. At the end of the day, it's a moot point as far as this video is concerned, since there's already a Thomas character called Duke. In fact, if I stick to the idea of these engines running the Alsborough line, they probably would have met Duke, since the branch line connects with the Mid-Sodor Railway at Alsborough. You also might have noticed that I haven't given any of these engines numbers, and that's mainly because the original figurines didn't have numbers, and I'm trying to pay homage to the first 5 books in the Railway series, because they don't get numbers until book number 6. I suppose that Rocket, Puff and Shunt could be numbers 7, 8 and 9, because obviously the 6th book, when they first get their numbers, takes place after Percy arrives on the railway but before Toby arrives, and given that the Alsborough branch line is closed in 1947, that means that these engines will have probably left the railway before Toby arrives, and so that then frees up the number 7. Partway through, I remembered that the Puff figurine has a yellow dome and chimney cap, so I quickly amended my drawing. The brass fittings definitely make him stand out more compared to the other green engines. So you might have noticed that despite being a Bandon tank, I have incorrectly given Puff rounded cab windows. Don't worry, that will be amended later on. Drawing the sleepers is always the least fun part of doing a railway illustration, because it's not the most interesting thing to draw, and it's can often be a pain to get them looking right. Sometimes the perspective tends to go all wrong, and as you can see, I've actually had to amend them after drawing them once. So this was actually the first of the 3 drawings I did, and you might be able to tell because it's the only one where I've drawn the engine first, or coloured the engine first, and the background afterwards. And I would definitely recommend, certainly when doing this sort of illustration, to do the background first and then the engine, or whatever focal point you're drawing. For me at least, it's easier to make the drawing look more cohesive if the background is painted first, and then you paint the foreground elements to complement the background, rather than starting with the engine like I've done here, and then try and tailor the background to suit the focal piece. But then I suspect different methods work better for different people. And after I'd thought I'd completed the image, it seemed a little imbalanced, so I added a little boy waving to the engine. And then I realised that the Bandon tanks have square cab windows rather than round ones, so of course that had to change. And so, just to refresh everyone's minds, here is the original ornament, and here is my take. I went through several engine classes whilst trying to find a basis for Shunt. The big challenge was to create an 060 tank engine in northwestern blue, but have it not look like Thomas. My first thought was the North Staffordshire Railway number 23, since, as you can see, it kind of looks like the figurine, but ultimately went against this for two reasons. Firstly was that there was only one of these ever built, which was then rebuilt into a tender engine, so it's unlikely it would have come into the ownership of the NWR, at least not as a tank engine. The other issue is that number 23 was not a shunting engine. It was made for suburban passenger work and then became a goods engine after its rebuild. Next I had the idea of making Shunt a Hudswell Clark 060 tank, and even did a preliminary drawing. However, I ultimately thought that this engine looked too much like Thomas. Plus, I'm not sure whether it would line up chronologically given the backstory I've devised for these characters. So finally, I went with a Caledonian Railway 498 class. These were dock shunters with outside cylinders, so more than adequate for what I was after. Basically, my idea is that Shunt was the Alsborough Harbour shunter, mainly just arranging trucks and helping to load and unload cargo, and occasionally she'd make trips to Teignmouth when nobody else is available. Perhaps she is the little tank engine that arranged James's goods train in troublesome trucks. The figurine of Shunt has a bit of a cheeky smirking expression compared to the wide grins of the other two engines. Cheeky tank engines are pretty common on Sodor. There's Thomas, Percy, Bill, Ben, and even Toby isn't above being a bit cheeky, so one more can't hurt. Shunt could be a sort of annoying little sister figure to Rocket and Puff, sticking her smokebox into their business and saying things for the sole purpose of winding them up. Alsborough Harbour is a location that we don't see in the books, so I've loosely based this scene on Aberdeen docks. I'm quite pleased with how the background buildings turned out, and how the blue of the engine really pops against the beiges and browns of the surrounding area. This was the last of the 3 drawings I did for the video, and so I was a little more prepared this time. Rather than using a whole image for colour reference that I would refer back to every time, you can see that I've made myself a palette that I can refer back to more quickly. Something interesting I've noticed that wasn't wholly intentional when I started out is that the colours of each engine reflect the engines I based them on. Rocket is red, like a flat iron, as we've already discussed. Puff is green, which was the livery of the Cork, Bandon and South Coast Railway. And whilst I don't think the 498s were ever painted blue in service, blue is still the colour of the Caledonian Railway. So even if these engines are wearing northwestern liveries, they're still paying some tribute to the liveries of their old lines. So once again, to refresh everyone's memory, here is what the original figurine looked like, and here is my take. I hope you've enjoyed watching me draw these engines and hearing me waffling on about them. I've enjoyed drawing these, and I'm hoping to put out more videos about drawing Thomas stuff. Let me know what you think. Would you like to see more of these 3 engines? Maybe there are more generic toy trains that you'd like to see as Thomas characters. Comment down below and subscribe for more.